Brilliant. Let's begin, Dr. Durbach.
Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices. First, thank you for all of your letters. Please continue sending them as it helps us determine what you would like to hear in the future. Our speaker today is Dr. William Ram, who is on our board of directors for many years, and who has participated in many of our United Nations conferences on health and environment, global partners for global solutions, and programs providing new information to our audiences. Our moderator, Apurv Kabir Gupta, the innovator of this webinar, will now continue. Apurv.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach. Dr. Ram, it's a pleasure to have you joining WIT's Virtual Voices series. As Dr. Durbach mentioned, Dr. Ram has been a close associate of World Information Transfer. He's currently the Professor of Medicine and Environmental Medicine at NYU School of Medicine. And he's emeritus, and he's also a research scientist at the NYU School of Global Public Health. Dr. Ram, again, it's a pleasure to have you. We have a very eager young crowd joining these webinar series who look forward to your perspectives on these very important topics. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm honored to be able to talk to you about this novel coronavirus. This is a new virus and it's a new disease. So I, as well as anybody else, is not an expert on it because it's brand new. My sources are the New York Times, if you believe that, New England Journal of Medicine, Science, and Nature. So I'll be updating everybody on the literature related to this novel virus. First of all, this is a virus different from bacteria. Bacteria have a cell wall, and antibiotics block the cell wall from reproducing and kill the bacteria. So antibiotics don't work on viruses because they don't have a cell wall. So we don't have a treatment for viruses. We have to have our body's defenses get over it. So basically treatment for viral illnesses is supported. We have developed some new antivirals with the treatment of HIV, and some of those have been used in this novel coronavirus. So the coronavirus is about 250 viruses can infect humans. And this virus was first noted in December in China. The first case was actually ill on December 1st and was hospitalized in a city called Wuhan on December 16th. Wuhan, if you haven't heard about it, is a large city in eastern central China, about 11 million people. And there are direct airline flights from Wuhan throughout the world, including about 40 of them to the United States. There was a doctor who was very famous in Wuhan, Wen Liang. Wen Liang was one of the first doctors to treat some of these patients who were admitted to the hospital. They had high fever, cough, shortness of breath, and they developed pneumonia. The pneumonia was very unusual. It was bilateral and severe. On December 30th, he put a post on his social media page calling this a SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And this was noted by the Chinese authorities. He was called into the police station, and they made him sign a statement calling this illegal behavior for sharing information on this new virus. Unfortunately, Dr. Wen Liang developed this infection himself. It was called Wuhan Pneumonia on December 31st, and the officials in Wuhan said that this was preventable and controllable. And in the next few days, they had more cases, and they were characterized by fevers, and they were all coming from the Huanan seafood wholesale market, a wet market in the center of Wuhan. On January 1st, this food market was shut down and disinfected. On January 1st, the WHO, the World Health Organization in Beijing, was alerted. There were 6 or 7 cases immediately, and swabs were taken from the back of their throat. And in several cases, some of the lung tissue was obtained. And there is a very famous Wuhan Institute of Virology 20 miles away from the food market. The Institute of Virology sequenced the entire genome, and by January 10th, they released this genome online to everybody in the world. But during this time, on January 7th, there were members of a single family known to be infected, suggesting that there was human-to-human spread. Wuhan had a huge potluck celebration on this first week in January, and 40,000 families attended. This would be an ideal place to spread the virus. By January 10th, there were 41 cases and 1 death already. So the Wuhan Institute posted the entire genetic sequence on January 10th, and they also posted what's called a reverse transcriptase PCR polymerase chain reaction test, where you can actually test for the virus. This is called a RT-PCR test, and it's a nucleotide testing kit. And this was the first kit to detect the virus. So by January 10th, China had provided the world with the sequence and a testing kit for the world. By January 12th, there was a surge of cases. So all of this was happening in Wuhan. On January 5th, a very notable date, Dr. Ram, that's me, was on a plane to China. And I landed in Shanghai, and NYU has a campus in Shanghai. And we had a J term called a January term, where I taught 17 master's students climate change and global public health. On January 11th and 12th, we all traveled throughout China, some up to Beijing. I took the bullet train halfway to Wuhan from Shanghai to climb some mountains. So on January 12th, they had a surge of cases. January 13th, there was the first case in Thailand. And on January 18th, Beijing authorities were very worried and called Zhang Nanshan, a SARS expert from Beijing, to go to Wuhan to find out what was happening. And by January 20th, he reported that there was a novel coronavirus. It would be spread by human-to-human contact. And he alerted Xi Jinping, the leader of China, who took action on January 20th. On January 23rd, Wuhan was completely shut down. They built a 1,000-bed hospital in 10 days, and the province Hubei, with 56 million people, was closed. China was entering its Lunar New Year, and hundreds of millions of people would be traveling. This was shut down, and on January 30th, the entire country of China was shut down. Dr. Ram, back there in Shanghai, was able to fly home on January 18th. On January 18th, there was no temperature or medical or questionnaire or anything at the Newark airport when I landed. We were seemingly unawares of this epidemic in the United States. When I was in China, I saw TV programs telling everybody about Wuhan pneumonia, and they actually posted x-rays showing it was a bilateral pneumonia, and this was getting publicity on BBC, CNN, as well as Chinese channels. On January 23rd, the WHO, World Health Organization, had a meeting to determine if this was a epidemic of public health concern. On January 23rd, the experts of the WHO thought it was too soon to declare this a public health emergency. So they did not declare it until January 30th, when they had a second meeting. On January 30th, they said this was a public health emergency of international concern. So January 30th, WHO declared this a pandemic, January 30th. At the same time, 250,000 test kits were made available to 159 laboratories around the world by WHO. The Centers for Disease Control here in the United States declined to accept these WHO test kits because they had their own. They had developed 3 targets instead of just one, so it was a more advanced test, and sent it out to public health laboratories, but this kit did not work. One of those 3 was contaminated, and the United States was left without any kits for the month of January. On January 31st, the President of the United States barred entry from China. American travelers coming from China were then quarantined. United and Delta suspended their flights. Alex Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, declared COVID-19 a public health emergency. He said the current risk was low for the United States, but we realized that in 2018, we had 8.5 million travelers coming back and forth from China, so that this was a illness that could be easily spread. A very prominent infectious disease epidemiologist, Dr. Michael Osterholm at the University of Minnesota Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, said that, quote, "The cows are already out of the barn and we are talking about shutting the door," so that he felt that the virus was already in the United States. In February, the first US case was January 19th, but in February, there were 3 patients hospitalized in the state of Washington, same place as the first case, who was a traveler from Wuhan. 3 patients were hospitalized, with 2 coming from a nursing home and 1 having no contact to a nursing home who perished. The CDC made an investigation. This is February 29th of these first 3 cases. And Dr. Nancy Messonnier said, quote, "We continue to prepare for this virus to become widespread in the US." That was on February 29th. She was fired. She was head of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Disease, because at that time, the United States did not want anybody to get worried and act accordingly. So the CDC was sidelined for the whole month of February instead of preparing for this pandemic. Nancy Messonnier, interestingly, is a sister of Rod Rosenstein, who was the person who ordered the Mueller investigation from the Department of Justice. There was a pandemic in 2009 under President Obama, and he set up a national pandemic response program, and he put this into the National Security Council so that the United States would be prepared for pandemics of this nature. Last summer, John Bolton, who is the director of the National Security Council, abolished this national pandemic response. So the United States had no pandemic response experts, and the CDC was sidelined. So back to the virus. So I said this is a very small virus. There are 2 kinds of viruses. One is called DNA and the other is called RNA. So RNA comes from DNA, and the influenza and coronaviruses are RNA viruses, If I haven't mentioned it, I should mention it now, that there are 6.6 million cases of coronavirus across the globe, with 388,000 deaths. In the United States, we have 1.8 million cases and 108,000 deaths. But the number for you to remember is that in the United States, there are still 20,000 cases every single day. And we now have hotspots like Utah going up, Florida going up. We have Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, even California going up. So we have not flattened the curve. This morning, the New York Times called this the radical right, illiberal, populist countries having the worst of the pandemics: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, and Brazil. So those are the hotspots in the globe. So now back to the virus. This virus is twice as big as the influenza virus. It's 1/1000th of a human hair in size. And if you imagine one person standing on the planet Earth, that one person would be the size of the RNA virus, and the planet Earth would be the size of a human being. So that's how the comparison is between the virus and us. We learned a little bit about coronaviruses back with SARS and MERS. There are 4 coronaviruses that cause the common cold, or 1/3 of the common colds are made from these 4 coronaviruses. And if you think hard and long, we get the common cold every single year. So if you have antibodies against these viruses, they don't seem to work very well. So that's something to keep in mind. The SARS virus for severe acute respiratory syndrome occurred in 2002 and 3. This was the first coronavirus that became epidemic. 8,000 people were infected, primarily in China, Hong Kong, and Singapore and Southeast Asia. There were 800 deaths, and it was quarantined into oblivion. But you can imagine that's a 10% mortality. The mortality in the COVID-19, the current coronavirus, is 1%. But the mortality of influenza is 0.1%. So the novel coronavirus is 10 times as lethal as the common flu. So it's something to be concerned about. Following the SARS 2002-3 epidemic, there was MERS. That's the Middle East respiratory syndrome. That was 2012. There were 850 cases in 20 countries, and that one was much more fatal. 40% died. Both the SARS and the MERS came from bats. And they had an intermediate host, and for the SARS virus, it was an Asian palm civet, which is like a kitty cat. For the MERS virus, it was a dromedary camel. That's a camel with 1 hump. The COVID-19 novel coronavirus has 70% identity to the SARS virus from 2002. However, it has 96% identity to a coronavirus that lives in the bat. So there are numerous coronaviruses that live in bats, and bats seem to adapt to these, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology studies these. And there has been no intermediate carrier discovered yet for COVID-19. Importantly, when the Wuhan Institute sequenced this virus, they knew that it came from a bat, but they had no sequences like this in their entire library. So there's no way this virus was produced by the Wuhan Institute, contrary to statements like Secretary of the State Mike Pompeo, which is terrible misinformation. All right, back to the virus. There are 29,811 nucleotides in the virus. So it's about 30,000 bases in length. That's a pretty large RNA virus. There are 29 proteins in this virus. Now, the important thing about this structure is the Chinese sequenced it, and the Chinese and Americans and Europeans rapidly tried to crystallize all these 29 proteins to determine their structure. How you crystallize them is you have to purify the protein, and then you have to use transmission electron microscopy or cryo-electron microscopy to actually visualize the structure of the protein. So they have published all of these structures in Nature primarily, and the most important protein is called the spike. I think all of you now have seen these beautiful photographs of the coronavirus, which is like a little circle with all these crowns coming out from the virus, and all those crowns are always colored red. I don't know who chose the red color, but it's really beautiful. So those spikes coming out is called the spike protein, and the end of the spike protein has an RBD. RBD stands for receptor binding protein, RBD, receptor binding protein. The receptor binding protein is very similar to the SARS-1 virus from 2002, except it has a couple tiny changes. And the receptor binding protein binds to human cells. It binds on a receptor called ACE2. ACE2, ACE2. That stands for angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2. So the spike protein binds to ACE2. So where do you find ACE2 in the human body? You find it in the nose, you find it in the throat, and you find it in the lung. So this virus can bind to the nose and the throat and to the lungs. So that's the main place of illness. The virus with these changes is much better at binding ACE2 than the SARS virus. So that's why this virus is able to be so contagious and spread from human to human. It has a novel RBD. So looking at antibodies, we want to block the binding, and we want to develop a vaccine that will block this spike protein. So that's a target. The other thing we learned about this virus is that it's very stable. It has a protein that prevents any mutations. So it's stable so that if we develop drugs or vaccines, we don't have to worry about the virus mutating. HIV is a virus that mutates like mad, and it's very hard to develop a vaccine since it's continually changing. Some of the proteins turn off cell alarms, and then this spike protein has a site where it can be cleaved. And this site is called a Fearin site, and Fearin is spelled F-U-R-I-N. This is a common protein in human cells. And when the Fearin is activated with the binding to the ACE2, the Fearin cuts off the spike and the virus binds to the cell and enters the cell. So the human cells have a mechanism that unfortunately allows the virus to invade. Once the virus is in the cell, it attacks the ribosomes and tells the ribosomes to make viral proteins. The viral proteins then are cleaved with another coronavirus protein called main protease, MPRO, main protease. This protease cuts the proteins so that they're right size, and then the virus can use these proteins to make new RNA and then spread to other cells. So a protease is another drug target, and many investigators are looking at that. Lastly, there is another viral protein with a very important name called RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So RNA polymerase makes the RNA. RNA polymerase then is another drug target, and you have heard of remdesivir. Remdesivir attacks this polymerase. Okay, everybody is an expert on the virus. It binds highly to respiratory epithelial cells in the nose, throat, and lungs. Okay, for epidemiology, we're beginning to learn that it's spread where there is human meetings. There was a biotech meeting in Boston where executives flew to attend a meeting of about 50 people, and they had a dinner and cocktail hour, and then they went to home all over the world, and more than half of them developed COVID-19. So exposure. So this is a respiratory exposure, breathing the virus that's expelled from sneezing, coughing, speaking, singing. A choir was another hotspot. Meat packing plants where people work closely together. Immigration detention, prisons. It's particularly hazardous on cruise ships. The Diamond Princess had many cases in Japan. One ship with 217 passengers that went to Antarctica had 128 positive cases. Excuse me. Of those 128, 104 were asymptomatic, 80%. The 24 with symptoms included 8 who were hospitalized, 4 who were intubated, and 1 who died. we're learning that certain groups are highly susceptible, particularly African Americans and Latinos. They're 3 times more likely to be infected because of living in close quarters in apartment buildings. The Navajo are particularly susceptible because they live in small buildings. So most of the cases are mild. 80% are mild. Anywhere from 35 to 55% are asymptomatic. 16% are hospitalized, 4% in the ICU, 1% die. And preventing this is to avoid anybody with respiratory symptoms. Wear a mask. The N95 mask protects against 2.5 micron particles, but it's difficult to wear. It's only recommended for healthcare workers. But a mask will prevent you from exposing others and also protect you a little bit. So a mask is mandatory and it's cool. New York tough. We wear masks in New York. If you cough or sneeze, cover your mouth. Wash your hands with soap. The soap kills the virus. You need 20 seconds of washing your hands. That means washing both hands, washing your thumbs, getting your wrist, scrub every time a day. Every time you go out, you come back, you scrub. Every time you do anything, you come back, you scrub. 6 feet of distancing is very important, and avoid being around anybody for more than 10 or 15 minutes. And contact tracing, they use either 15 minutes or 10 minutes as the duration of exposure. That's important. The test for the virus is RT-PCR that I mentioned. It's recommended for healthcare workers and symptomatic, but now it's virtually everybody. You use a nasal swab or throat swab. In the US, we've now done 12 million tests, about 3% of the population. So the symptoms, fever is important. So that's why you have fever checks when you enter hospitals, or now we may have fever checks for universities and everything. Cough is a big symptom, and then shortness of breath. Shortness of breath is the worrisome one, because that means it's getting down to your lungs. And what this virus does is it overwhelms these cells, it kills these cells, so you can imagine your whole lungs being just a massive rubble of all these cells being killed. And once that happens, you can't get oxygen into your blood, and you test your fingers with this oximeter, this pulse oximeter, and you see that your 95% saturation of oxygen drops below 90, down into the 80s, 70s, or 60s. That means you're developing COVID pneumonia, viral pneumonia. The viral pneumonia is treated with oxygen. You need a face mask, and you want to avoid a ventilator. Ventilators take over everything if you become intubated. You're basically anesthetized, so you don't fight the ventilator. And it takes weeks for your lungs to heal. We found that taking a patient and putting them on their stomach, called the prone position, actually improves oxygenation. So if you have a face mask and you lie on your belly, you probably can avoid being put on a ventilator. These patients are treated with everything: remdesivir, interferons, antivirals, sometimes steroids, and there's something called convalescent plasma. Convalescent plasma is the plasma from somebody who's already been infected. If you infuse this convalescent plasma, there have been a number of successful outcomes, and that seems to be like the best treatment. But convalescent plasma has been around for a long time, for more than a century. We know that antibodies will treat individuals with these viral diseases. There's an instrument called ECMO, E-C-M-O, extracorporeal membrane oxygenator. This is if somebody is on a ventilator and still not responding well. They are placed on this machine that oxygenates the blood. It's like a heart-lung blood machine where your blood is oxygenated outside of your body. So dozens of patients have been put on this ECMO. Antibody testing, you've heard about antibody testing. The COVID or coronavirus does produce antibodies. And initially, these are what are called immunoglobulin M antibodies that occur in about a week, but they decline rapidly. And immunoglobulin G antibodies occur between days 7 and 14 and are generally against the spike protein, but we don't know too much yet about what these antibodies are against. We don't know about the titer. It seems that those who have the more severe illness have a higher titer or more amount or quantity of these antibodies, and we don't know how long they last, and we don't know if they neutralize the virus or kills the virus. So we have a lot to learn about antibodies. There are many different kinds of tests, some of them very good, some of them very poor. So it's ambiguous now how quality these tests are. And 24 April, WHO warned against using antibody tests as an immunity passport to go back to work because the accuracy is not guaranteed. There were 3,000 New Yorkers who were randomly tested and 15% had antibodies. So you can see that this virus has made its rounds in New York. In addition to the lungs, these patients have a systemic disease. Their kidneys may fail, the liver is infected, and you may have liver enzymes abnormal. There's cognitive impairment as the brain gets infected. You've heard about these red skin, that the skin gets infected. You've heard that people go on anticoagulants because they get emboli into their lungs. Some patients go and have heart failure because it affects the heart muscles. You get conjunctivitis. You've heard that one of the tests to see if you have coronavirus is that you can't smell. So it affects the nose and the tongue. You lose your smell and taste. Many patients have diarrhea, so the GI tract is affected. There's something called pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome when children get infected. This is probably related to what's called cytokine storm. Our cells produce inflammatory mediators called cytokines, and if you produce tons of this, your body goes into shock. So these are called interleukins. And interleukin 1 and 6 are two of the more potent ones. So some of the treatments for coronavirus include monoclonal antibodies that block these cytokines. And there's one called tocilizumab, which is anti-IL-6 receptor that's being tested. How do you combat coronavirus? Well, it's case finding and contact tracing. Test, trace, and isolate. Test, trace, and isolate. How many times have you heard Nancy Pelosi say, test, trace, and isolate? You know, everything she says is not heard over at the White House, even though she screams, test, trace, and isolate. That's how you control it. There's a great article in the New Yorker this week about Iceland, how they did testing, tracing, and isolating, and basically eliminated the coronavirus from Iceland. In China, they have smartphones to test, trace, and isolate. If you have green on your smartphone, you're able to go in. If you have yellow, you're stopped. You can't get on the subway. If you're red, you're quarantined and told to go home. So now, even entering New York University at the medical school, you have to take your temperature in the morning and fill out on your smartphone whether you have any symptoms just to get into the hospital. But I do want to say something that marginalized groups are particularly at risk because we're now experiencing racism in its worst forms in the United States with police violence. And Blacks, I said, are 3 times at risk for developing coronavirus. John Muir, our great environmentalist, said, quote, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So this is sort of like coronavirus and race. You find that everything is attached to everything else. African Americans live in areas where there is more pollution. They have poor food choices, so they get obese, they develop diabetes, they have hypertension, they have less ability to receive health care. So all of those increase their risks for developing COVID-19. We've recently seen that these are areas with higher particulate matter from air pollution, and the air pollution will increase the risk of developing COVID-19. For each microgram of air pollution, you have an 8% increase in risk of death from COVID-19. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the treatments. You have heard about something called an anti-malarial called hydroxychloroquine, and that President Trump decided to self-administer this with his White House doctor, despite lack of any evidence that this will provide a benefit. So hydroxychloroquine is called Plaquenil, and we used it in the 1970s for sarcoidosis of the nose. I remember being a medical fellow, a pulmonary fellow at that time, and our great sarcoidosis teacher, Dr. Siltzbach, would prescribe Plaquenil for treating sarcoidosis of the nose. Since that time, hydroxychloroquine has been used as a treatment for rheumatoid arthritis with some benefit. So it has several uses. It is originally an anti-malarial, but hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine have been used so much that most of the malarial organisms have developed resistance to them, so they're not so useful anymore. Physicians like myself and Dr. Fauci have recommended that patients not take hydroxychloroquine until there's randomized clinical trials showing whether there's any benefit and that it would be safe. So those are ongoing. There have been 3 studies that are observational from the VA, 1 and 2 letters published in the New England Journal and JAMA, showing that those who took hydroxychloroquine were more likely to die from COVID-19, and those who didn't take it were more likely to live. The New England Journal just had an article showing that if you take it as a preventive, compared to those who didn't take it, that it didn't work. Don't take hydroxychloroquine. All right, vaccines. Vaccines, we've all heard vaccines, very important. So we're hoping that a vaccine will be developed in a year and that we can get a shot and become protected against COVID-19. So there are 100 candidates going for a vaccine. There are 5 being funded by the US by what's called BARDA, the Biological Advanced Program, and our Warp Speed program. One is Moderna. Moderna is working with the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and they are making a RNA virus against using this spike RNA, the spike being that important piece of the virus. They've made their RNA, they put it in mice, and it blocked virus replication in the lungs. They have given it to 8 people, and they've developed antibodies. Their stock went up over $1 billion the next day. This hasn't been published yet. Several executives sold their stock and become 100 million millionaires. So it's a little bit murky with all this finance going on. They are now expanding this up to 45 individuals, and up to 25 have developed antibodies, and we don't know if they are neutralizing yet. So this company has a long way to go. Second is Oxford. Oxford was working on SARS and already had developed a spike protein. So they were able to make a COVID-19 spike protein and put it into a attenuated adenovirus, adenovirus 5. They put it in 6 monkeys, and it prevented pneumonia, but the noses were full of virus, but they had given these monkeys high doses. So this one is tied with AstraZeneca. Johnson & Johnson has one with Janssen, Merck and Pfizer are the others. All of them seem to be focusing on the spike RNA and putting it into viruses. All of these are technologies that aren't really out there for measles or influenza. Those are attenuated viruses. So we're at the door of new science, and whether these will work or not is a question. So the phase 2 studies are to look at antibodies, 600 to 800 people, and then they go into phase 3, which will be 30,000 volunteers for each one of the 5, a total of 150,000 volunteers, hopefully this fall. And with the phase 3, we look to see if it has efficacy. So for phase 3, there has to be enough COVID-19 around for infecting people so that you can see if this has what's called efficacy. And we also want to see if there are side effects. We want to see if these things cause cytokine storm or anything like that. All right. Coronavirus Task Force. You heard that Vice President Pence was put in charge of this. And then Debbie Birx was the leading health person. Debbie Birx is in charge of the AIDS program that the US funded in Africa. Robert Redfield, the head of CDC, and Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci is the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Dr. Rom, that's me, by the way, worked at the NIH in the 1980s, and Dr. Fauci introduced himself to me about 5 times saying, "I'm Dr. Fauci, I have a patient for you to see, Dr. Rom." So I met him at least 5 times, and I would bronchoscope his patients with granulomatosis and provide samples and biopsies for him for his research. So I can attest that he's a wonderful guy and very friendly and extremely bright. And when he says that he's worried about a second wave, worry about it. So this coronavirus task force was involved with PPE, masks, gloves, gowns, shields, N95s, ventilators, and so on and so forth, and tried to deal with these shortages. January 22nd to March 10th. President Trump dismissed the threat. The department was saying that ultraviolet light kills it, particularly from sunshine. So on March 15th, the United States was closed down everywhere. Dr. Rom was skiing in Aspen, and we had our big race on April 14th, thank goodness, and I stood up and made it and got a medal for 3rd place, but there were only 3 of us in the over 70 category. And March 15th, the governor closed all the ski areas and everybody's been sheltering in place. And here I am in New York. Columbia came out with a study showing that if we closed down 1 week earlier, we would have saved 36,000 lives. If we closed down 2 weeks earlier, we would have saved 54,000 lives. So some of that should be President Trump's responsibility. I think at that point, I'm going to open this up to questions. There's a lot more that could be said, but I think I would prefer to have you talk about your concerns and questions, and I'll be happy to take these for the next 20 minutes.
Okay, yes,
back. But I don't have a question.
Very sorry, there's a storm going out, and that's
yes, I already said that. Continue with the question.
Dr. Rom, as you know, which is, like many other organizations, the conscience of the United Nations. And therefore, what we would love to explore with you is your medical opinion on how some of these institutions have handled the coronavirus situation and the outbreak. I'm specifically looking towards the World Health Organization. We have a question that directly very much asks, do you think the World Health Organization could have done something differently that could have contained the outbreak much sooner, much faster, and not gotten to this stage?
Yes. In reviewing all of these articles, it was said that the Chinese delayed 6 days, and that could have prevented much of the spread across the globe. I searched through the early and mid-January events, and the Chinese were pretty aggressive at that point, but perhaps between about January 17th and the 23rd, they might have been able to be a little bit faster in closing down Wuhan and closing down all the planes. They did notify the WHO. The WHO had that meeting on January 23rd and did not call this a pandemic when it probably was. They just didn't have the proper information to make a decision. And 1 week later, they did have the information and they declared it a pandemic on the 30th. And the WHO provided testing kits to everybody. Critical amount. The Gates Foundation supports an awful lot of WHO's budget. but the US is probably going to take this $450 million and use much of it to develop a COVID pandemic response where we have unilateral actions where we provide funding to countries that we want to influence in the third world or the sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, whereas the Chinese are already providing respirators, gloves, masks, personal protective equipment, testing kits to all of these countries. So there is a foot race to provide these things between China and the US, and China is way out ahead. So we'll have to see. Things are in flux, as you well know, in the United States. We have an election coming up.
Excellent. Dr. Rom, we have a very important question surrounding patents. With the relaxations around the globe on patent laws, Alex Rosello from Spain inquires, is that enough incentives for big pharma companies to produce a vaccine in speed in record time?
There is a very large funding stream to these pharmaceutical companies to develop and commercialize this vaccine. I think it should be provided free of charge to everybody, not only the country that produces it, but globally. What's going to happen is very likely there will be several candidates that will emerge. Since there are 100 scientific approaches, and there are at least 5 that have received hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars from the US government, that gearing up will happen quickly. These vaccines are novel in that they're RNA or protein structures, and instead of having to grow these in eggs like the influenza vaccine, they are grown in cells, so that the cells can be grown in huge bottles and large volumes so that you can quickly scale up to produce these vaccines. Shortages may be in syringes and glass vials to contain the vaccine, so these companies are already trying to look ahead and prepare this. The real challenge for scientists and epidemiologists and the health community is to look at efficacy and side effects of these vaccines, because we know so little about the antibodies and the cell-mediated immunity and how durable these will be, and whether you need more than the spike protein. So there's scientific questions that are out there that I think in the next few weeks we'll learn a lot just from animal testing, which of these vaccines produce high titer antibodies. We don't know the amount of vaccine to put in the syringe. We don't know if we should have 1 or 2 or 3 shots. We don't know how far it should be apart. So we're dealing with a lot of unknowns that we have to develop knowledge very quickly. And the companies have not so much the financial incentive. They're already getting a lot of money, more money than they can deal with. So I think that foot race will be successful. What I'm worried about more than that is the second wave. If we have a second wave later this summer or in the fall, when schools open, when universities open, children do have this multi-system inflammatory disorder, but children generally are not the ones who die. It's the elderly, and the teachers are the elderly, so they're at risk. Universities the same way. And then of course there's the huge economic cost. Universities live by their tuition, and if they don't open, they don't have the tuition. There are a lot of considerations going on about all of this opening that we will be dealing with all summer long.
Yeah. And Dr. Rom, from a government perspective, and I know you spoke about antibodies and the development of different kinds of antibodies within people who already sort of contract the virus. many governments around the world have spoken about the concept of herd immunity and have actually based their own national policies around this, the UK being one example from which they backtrack later on. And now we're beginning to hear herd immunity conversations take place in India as well. Is this genuinely a concept that governments can rely upon? Can the virus rip through a population and then eventually die down?
Herd immunity develops after 60 to 70% of the population develops antibodies to it. That stops the spread of the virus through the population. There are several problems with the approach to herd immunity. The first one is that there's 1% mortality. That's huge. Sweden is the country, that's the example of where they did not close down the economy. They just banned group gatherings more than 50, and they did not stop all travel. And Sweden has had an order of magnitude greater mortality than Finland or Norway to their right or left. And they've been roundly criticized for their approach. And they're now beginning to make the closures more rigorous, and there are second thoughts about that approach. The other thing with herd immunity is we don't know how durable these antibodies are and how rigorous they are in neutralizing the virus. The question arises, can you get a second infection from the virus? And that's not clear yet. And some of the individuals who have the asymptomatic or mild cases have very low titer antibodies. So we don't know if that low titer will be protective or not, which also gets back to the vaccine. You have to have a vaccine that produces a high titer of antibodies. So herd immunity is probably going to be what's going to happen in India because of the huge population and the large number of individuals living in poverty and in rural areas. So the virus seems to begin in cities, but then spreads to rural areas. And we're seeing that in the United States now.
Yeah. And Dr. Rom, as the spread of COVID-19 is such an urgent and topic that's in prime focus around the world, there are multiple studies coming out on a daily basis that are correlating different facets and different factors with the spread of the disease. I've seen papers written on certain blood types being more susceptible to COVID-19. There are different categorizations on ethnic grounds that certain populations seem to be better immune than other populations. Are there any other sort of credible correlations in your view that can help us better understand how COVID-19 is going to play out as it makes its way across the globe?
That's a good question. So blood group A seems to be more susceptible for the severe form of COVID-19. They've also noticed one spot on chromosome 3 that seems to be at risk, but there are a whole number of genes on chromosome 3, one being an immunity one. So that's being worked on as I speak. The increase among African Americans and Latinos and Navajo natives in America probably relates to social economic considerations where they live in closer quarters in apartments or in small houses where their people are more densely packed. And that's of major concern for disparities and inequality. In New York City, where I am now, there was an article by the Times that showed where all the wealthy people in the high wealth zip codes have spread to Florida and California and New Jersey and Connecticut and upstate New York. And I enjoy going into Central Park with my mask on every day to ride my bicycle because there's nobody there. And it's beautiful. So we do get out and protect ourselves, but you need to get some exercise. So I suspect there will be a lot of mental health issues from all of these quarantines because people are spending so much time indoors. There may be spousal abuse and things. I've gotten to know my spouse infinitely better over the past 12 weeks than we actually enjoy cooking and doing things together. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Rom. I think we've seemed to almost run out of time, but there is one last question, and if you can keep the answer very brief, is how do you see this play out now? Where do we go from now? Does masks and gloves and social distancing become the new normal for the world, or do we actually see things returning back to the old normal?
I think we have a long way to go with masks and social distancing, at least until a vaccine, and then there has to be a new development of trust. We have to trust our neighbors, and we have to trust our government leaders, and we have to trust our health experts, because there's so many unknowns. So I think as we open up, trust will be a very important value that we have to redevelop.
Excellent. Dr. Derbach, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think that was absolutely excellent, Bill. I enjoyed every second of it. Thank you for very valuable information. And I thank you again for being able to be with us and sharing all your knowledge with us as usual. So thank you. And Alpert, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, again, I echo Dr. Derbach's comments. Dr. Rom, thank you for that very invaluable presentation. Thank you to all the participants who have sort of joined all our Virtual Voices series. Please tune in to the next one, which is taking place on the 9th of June. We have Ms. Irina Zubtsevich, who is the chief of the Intergovernmental Panel and Review Branch in the Department of Economic and Social Council at the United Nations. So we look forward to having you there. And once again, Dr. Rom, thank you very much for being part of our webinar series.
You're welcome.
Be healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.